Welcome back, crew, to our third Meet the Maker. And today we've got Shanna Germain from Monty Cook Games join us, the creator of the Old Gods of Appalachia system. Thank you for jumping on, Shanna.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about this. I know you guys are doing a live play, so I'm excited to hear how it's going and all that good stuff.
We had a blast with the live play. This was my first time with the Cypher system too, so it was kind of cool getting to see that
Wow.
in action. And we had a lot of fun. I think one of my players is a big fan of the podcast, but it's one that my wife and I had like. I tried to get my wife to play with us, but unfortunately she's not a big tabletop gamer. But it's one that my wife and I love, and we've been listening to. I think the last 2 years, maybe. We caught up recently to it, so it's been a fun one. It was fun to
Nice.
bring it to the table.
It sounds like you should get her to like play a ghost on the side so that she can scare your players if she doesn't want to actually like get involved in the game.
That would be a fun way. I think she'd be fun, like
Be
scare the
cool.
players, hang out for a second, and then gotta go to her.
Yep.
She doesn't like. She's not one for rules on that side of mechanics, I should say.
Oh, I hear that. Thumbs up. Not a big fan of rules myself, so
But she does like the podcast. I was able to bounce a couple of ideas off her for the session, so that was nice on
nice.
that side. That's kind of a good question. So, were you aware of the podcast before kind of working on the game, or how'd you kind of get into designing Old Gods?
We have a member on our team, Tammy, who grew up in that area and was a big fan of the podcast. And then we had a mutual friend who introduced me to Cam and Steve, who are the sort of minds and voices behind the podcast. And as soon as I was like, "Oh, hey, they're looking for someone to make a game," Tammy was like, "Yes, please." And we had a couple other members of the team who were fans of the podcast as well. And so it kind of just I think as we all started to listen to the podcast, we were like, oh yeah, this totally fits with our aesthetics. And it turns out that I actually grew up in Appalachia, although upstate New York is sort of the outer edge of Appalachia. And so I didn't even realize that until I started doing research and stuff for the podcast. And I was like, oh, that's where all these sayings that my family has come from. I had no idea. So that was really fun.
Nice. I had no idea New York was kind of included in the Appalachian regions. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Just this one small part of upstate New York. And it's on the outer sort of edges. And yeah, I had no idea either. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I almost did it. I was going to reach out. I was looking for like a GM that had like a West Virginia accent. I tried my best to imitate it. It did not probably go well, but I almost tried to find a GM just because the narrator for the series just has like that iconic voice. So like I'll try this. It's not going to go well, but it's
Yeah.
still fun to do.
It's really hard to emulate. It is funny too because like a lot of the language sounds are again really minor where I grew up. Like there's an A sound that's very particular, but I've lived away from there long enough that I think I have lost all of that. But I can remember having it when I was young.
I've got that Midwest accent. I don't think I have it until I listen to one of my videos. I'm like, ooh, it really is there. Sounds right in my
Yep.
head, but well, with and kind of with kind of coming into the old gods, how'd you guys kind of like how was your process in designing it? How'd you guys kind of bring some of that old gods flavor into the book?
Yeah, you know what? It's one of my favorite parts of game design is sort of figuring out how the setting and the rules mesh and how to use the rules to like enhance and deepen the setting and the feel and the language and all those kinds of things. So like that's a part that I like to spend a lot of time in. So I did a lot of reading and I did a lot of research. I watched a lot of movies, I read a lot of fiction books, and listened, of course, to the podcast multiple times and just sort of immersed myself in the feel of what it would be like in the early 1900s to be in this region with this magic. And that's where, like, I often start with language. And so first I started thinking about the language. And in this case, it's interesting because you already have a lot of the language from the podcast. And then thinking about how to bring that into the rules and the character creation and the setting and those kinds of things. We had a really fantastic team working on this with me. And so we were able to really bring a lot of our insights into that space and just kind of mesh ideas, which is something I deeply enjoy. It's like, oh, what about this? Oh, but then if you add this to it and then you add this to it, and then you get this really wonderful, weird thing. And so working as a collaborative team is always really fun.
I do think the mechanics really flow well with the system. One of my favorites, and I'm not sure if this is one you introduced or if this is kind of part of the Cypher system, but I love GM intrusions. Like that's been one of my. It's one I'm probably going to steal for other systems because it's just fun for a GM to have with them full and actually have it happen without the sometimes getting in the way for it.
Yeah, they are so fun. They're part of the inherent cipher system. And the thing I love about them is like depending on what system you're in, like Old Gods has so much cool weirdness that your GM intrusions can just be these weird, wonderful, magical things. And your players are going, what? And I really love that. Whereas if it's in sci-fi, it becomes much more of like a sci-fi type thing. And so it's really malleable depending on the game, which is makes it very fun, I think. Although I do have some players that always will re-roll. If like, for example, if they roll a 1, they will always spend the XP if they have it and re-roll. And I'm like, no, let me do a intrusion.
I think my players are debating for the rerolls or just keeping them just in case something happened. I had one player that like yeah he did the same thing. He always wanted to get a better roll. The other one was looking more like that could happen, and I want to have this in reserve.
Yeah, it's like suddenly you've used them all. Yeah.
Well, with that, how did you kind of get into like tabletop design in the beginning? I was kind of looking through it, and it looks like you've worked on a lot of different projects.
It is true, and it's a weird road. Like I think a lot of people who work in the game industry got here by some convoluted funky method. And mine was that I was writing in other fields, and I started writing originally for World of Warcraft magazine because I was a big World of Warcraft player, and I was doing articles for them. I was doing articles. There were a couple online magazines back then that did a lot of gaming stuff, and so I was writing nonfiction articles about them. And then, but I was playing tabletop at the same time. And then I was having a conversation with Monty Cook, and he was like, I'm thinking about doing this little game. Like, I don't know if anyone's going to like it. It's just this thing I've been kind of noodling around with. And I was like, that sounds really interesting. Like, I have editing experience. I would love to like work on it and edit it. And then this tiny game that we were going to make turned into this huge, huge thing, which was unexpected and wonderful. And it kind of, I feel like we haven't slowed down from that point. So I had a lot of experience in writing and editing and all that kind of stuff before, but hadn't done actual very much game writing prior to working on Numera.
Nice. And yeah, I was kind of looking through some of the other writing works too. You've got kind of like a varied profile, I'll say, with the different things you write on.
I
I
do.
saw some
I do.
spicy ones in there too. For
Yeah. I wrote a lot of spicy stuff. It's very good money. Most fiction does not pay as well as erotica. So I was like, oh, I can make money doing this thing. That's really cool.
Nice. Well, definitely, and kind of a fun way to kind of like branch it out. I bet it kind of keeps it from getting old. You write some fantasy, kind of write some either erotica, kind of mix everything in one.
Yeah.
I bet.
Do a little horror. Yeah. I do like to have my fingers in a lot of different pots, which is one of the great things I love about writing a Safer System. Like I'm working on a fairy tale game right now, and I'm also working on Predation, an adventure for Predation, which is dinosaurs and time travel. And then, I feel like you can, as someone who has the sort of neuro spicy brain that really likes to do new things all the time, I feel like Cypher System really lets me go, oh, here's a thing I'm interested in. I'm going to write a game or an adventure or something about this. And it keeps me really interested in a way that other things might not.
Nice. And kind of was Numera the first game that you guys worked on too? That kind of like really.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we thought we were going to run this little tiny Kickstarter and maybe make, I don't know, a couple hundred books at most. And at some point we were sitting around going, this Kickstarter might hit $500,000. We'll make a movie if that happens. Ha ha ha. Right. And then it hit it. We were like, oh shit, we don't know what to do now. And yeah, so it really took off. And at that point we started to have conversations of like, we don't know how to fulfill $500,000 worth of books or anything, right? We weren't prepared. And so we started saying, who do we know? Do we really make a company like this? This is going to change the course of our lives. And that was, I think, 11 or 12 years ago. And obviously we decided to start a company, and now we have amazing people working on our team. And I don't know, I feel very lucky every day that we have such incredible people and that we've been able to build a company that has withstood a really difficult set of series in the industry and in the world, and all those kinds of things. So we were not prepared for this adventure, but I'm very glad we went on it.
Definitely, I mean, that's a good problem to have. More
Yeah.
people coming through. Numera, that's next. That's one of my next ones on my list. I almost picked it up at
Fun.
Gen Con, but I realized I had spent far too much at Gen Con. But uh, speaking of Gen Con, I want to give you guys a major shout out. I think you guys had like the best promotion at Gen Con with the miner that was kind of handing out different like the gift stick. Like, you guys had like the miner like really like decked out like full horror. Like that was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, he's actually a member of the gentleman who wore that outfit. At least part of it, I'm not sure if all the time, is a member of our art design team. And like we built that in house, and he did say it was very hot, but
I
it was
imagine.
very cool to be wearing it. And like yeah, they got excited about this idea and they kind of went and did amazing things with it, which is something that like we totally try to like honor and respect on our team. We're like, you got a cool idea and you're passionate about it, we give you the thumbs up, go run with it. So yeah, I think it turned out really cool.
It looked amazing. I didn't think about the heat, but yeah, I was in t-shirt and shorts when I was hot, so I imagine.
Yeah, yeah, I think it was pretty sweaty in there.
Well, I'm glad that you guys are doing well. Numera looks pretty sick too. My friend actually did pick it up, so I'm looking forward to try that one out. Uh, with kind of comes to old gods, one of the kind of the big pieces, kind of like the what I've been calling kind of the folksy eldritch horror. How did you guys kind of work with that portion? And I saw you guys who brought some of the cool pieces from like some of the big enemies, like the Railroad Man, one of my favorite
Yeah.
ones. He actually had him in my one shot. But what did you guys kind of bring some of that kind of like folksy eldritch horror into the system and kind of tweak some of the cipher system stuffs to fit that mold?
Yeah, I'm such a fan of folk horror. Like I think cozy horror is just such an interesting genre in general because it's like it's sort of an anomaly, right? Cozy and horror, how does that work? And yet it does, and it's cool. And then there's also this sort of folk element of like a very sort of touching the earth kind of place to it. And so I think one of the things that we worked really hard with Cam and Steve to do is make sure we brought all the places and the characters that people would want to touch in their game, right? We knew they would want to like come up against the Railroad Man. We knew they would want to see the Horned Head. We knew that there were very iconic, including Sam the dog, right? We knew, so we knew there were really iconic entities that they would want to be able to interact with. And so the hard part is, games are very rule heavy, even Cyber System, which is pretty rules light. And the podcast and is very much about like not creating any boundaries or rules and using language and evoking a sensibility as opposed to saying this thing's tough and here's how tough it is, right? And so one of the hard things was porting those two things together because the GM needs to have the level, for example, but we don't want them to say this is a level X. We want them to evoke how powerful and scary and weird and absolutely earth-shattering that entity is through language. And so we tried really hard to say like here's the level, but really what you want to do is create a creature that's so everything, so big, so weird, that the players feel that feeling as opposed to start calculating kind of how hard they have to hit and those kinds of things. And so that was the thing I think that we really kept in mind was how to bring the language and the sensibility and the feeling that it evokes and the sound and the sensory details, which is really so much about what that kind of horror is, right? It's not here's the thing that's going to whoop your ass. It's here's the thing that's going to freak you out and you're not going to understand it and it's going to hunt you down or it's going to offer you a bargain and you're not going to know whether to say yes. And so bringing that part into it was a lot of fun, but it was also we wanted to be a little bit handholdy with the jam and be like, right, these are some ways that you can use to present that sort of space and sound in the game.
I think that was really helpful. I was going through and just kind of reading through kind of the monster section, and in each of them, as you said, kind of had like how to play them and how to kind of like kind of interact with the players with them, which I think is kind of helpful because a lot of times, like you said, the monster manuals will kind of just give you their stats and how they attack and maybe a little bit of lore about them, but I really show you
Mm.
kind of the best way to interact with the players with them. And I had a lot of fun. I used the Railroad Man and Hollow Man, so they kind
Oh,
of gave you
fun.
different ways you can kind of utilize them to just mess with the players a bit. So I think that worked really well to kind of add to both the horror and a little bit of the lore at the same time.
Yeah, messing with the players feels a little important in a game like this. And the other thing that we had to do is we had to come up with some lower level entities because a lot of the entities in Old Gods are very powerful and they would just kill tier one players like out of the gate. And so we sort of had to funnel this sense and sensibility and come up with some creatures that either sort of already existed in that area's folklore that that the podcast hadn't touched on yet, or come up with some new entities that felt right in that world because we needed some things that were level 2 or level 3 so that not everything just squashed the creatures with or squashed the PCs with one blow.
Were the not deer part of? I was racking my brain. I used the not deer, but I couldn't remember if they were part of the podcast or not.
They're not, but they're part of the Appalachian sort of folklore history. There's a lot of not blank, like not deer, not bear, not whatever. And not deer seemed the most interesting because we already have the horned head. And so it sort of feels like you could use it as a lead up to this much more powerful and scary entity.
That was a cool one. I was like, I like, and one thing I really want to give you all credit for the artist on this knocked it out. Like the art for this, I think this is probably my favorite cover that I've got for any of the books
It
on
is
my
a
shelf
beautiful
right now.
cover. I love it very much. We, in fact, didn't input the authors' names or anything on the cover purposely because it's so beautiful. And we were like, more words are just going to make that less beautiful. And that's not something we normally do, but it just felt right to make this cover kind of its own thing.
Really stands out. I love like kind of the coloring on that side. Yeah, definitely kind of
Mm.
evokes the sense of Elder God. So really not great job on that one. Uh, with that, and kind of with kind of the bringing it in, you guys kind of utilize the cipher system as a base. What are some of your favorite mechanics that you've kind of brought in with that and kind of mixed in with a little bit of the old gods flavor?
One of my favorite bits was the artifacts. In regular cyber system, artifacts deplete. So, like, if it's a science thing or a magic thing, you use it a bunch of times, and eventually the dice rolls are like, "Hey, this just doesn't work anymore," right? For whatever reason, depending on the setting. And so, in Old Gods, because I felt like one of the really important parts was this sense of like owing things, I wanted the artifacts to instead what I call come due. And so when you roll, instead of the artifact depleting, although it still no longer works, you can get it to work again by making some kind of bargain or by paying the price. And those are not literal like here's some money. Those are like you're going to owe me a memory, you're going to do a task for me. And so there's this idea of bargaining, which is such a huge part of the game. And so I wanted players to think, okay, I have this really amazing whatever, this axe that does extra damage and is like super powerful, and yet okay, so it's come due, and so I can keep it and make it still do the thing, but I have to give something up. I have to make a trade, I have to make a deal. And I wanted that the players and the characters to be able to think about that and decide whether what power meant to them, whether it was worth it. So that was one of my favorite things, to kind of just tweak a little bit to make it fit more into the setting and kind of port it over. And the other thing I love doing, I love making character options. And so we have some real, like some of the character options that like have so much to do with, the one that goes down into the caves and spends too much time in the mining stuff and is affected by what happens down there, because part of Old Gods is so much about the trauma of what these workers went through who were exploited, and who all of these, there's all this trauma tied into that land and that history and that culture. And so I wanted to create characters who not all of them, but some who could honor that trauma and be affected by those things. And then there's characters who can interact with the green, which is that powerful entity. And so like coming up with characters that are deeply tied into the land and the language and the culture that's always really fun for me.
I think it really did a great job with that. And one of the things I wanted to kind of give you guys a shout out with too, is like I loved how much like information there was on the region with kind of each different state
Mm.
kind of broken out to kind of give you a feel for what's going on both in the podcast and like just the almost like a little bit of the real history of of that area itself. So you can at least because I know a lot of people probably aren't from those areas, myself included. So it was nice to kind of
Yeah.
have like some of those like reference points to pull back to.
Yeah, we were really cognizant of the fact that lots of people are not familiar with that area, and lots of people particularly not just people from outside the US, but people inside the US too, like not only are not familiar with the area, but also with that time period. Like there's we did a ton of research, and because I wasn't even super familiar with that time period. Like, did they have, refrigerators? Did they have phones? Were they common? Like what? And so we did a lot of research and tried to think of like, what are the basic questions that players and their characters are gonna like ask? Like, can you call someone? Can you drive a car? Like, how common are cars? And so we tried to fill people in on both without it becoming sort of a textbook, because you just sort of want to give them the flavor, and also to impart that like it's okay if you get it wrong, because you're all playing this together and you're making the world as you go. And if you decide that every household has a phone and every household has a car, well, that's anachronistic, but it's not necessarily wrong for the game that you're playing. And that's true too if you go off the podcast. Like if you're like, this didn't happen in the podcast, or this couldn't have happened, like that's okay, right? It's your game and it's at your table and that becomes your world. And so we wanted to make it clear that like while we were working hard off the podcast and what existed, and then also the time period and what existed, like you can do whatever you want as the GM. Like you can tweak things in any way, because that's just kind of how it should work, right? It should be yours.
Definitely, it's always kind of fun to give the players and the GM that freedom, as well as kind of both the resources too to kind of catch up. And I know sometimes as a GM, like I've had so many random Google searches that is all random things that like how does that actually work? So it's nice when it's already in the book for some of the things, so Google doesn't worry about me googling like how do people in the actual Appalachian sound and all that.
Yeah, and we also wanted to make sure we were steering people away from like the obvious stereotypes, right? Because
Definitely.
that, like, I mean, we all carry those with us, but we try to like do our best to get rid of those and to at least be cognizant. So we wanted to say like, here are the things to be aware of. Like if you're pushing in this direction, maybe reconsider. Because I think that one of the things that it seems like is true of that region is that people feel like they're particularly stereotyped against for being Appalachian, whether that's because people think they're poor or they're dumb or that they don't talk the right way or whatever. And so we really wanted to be like, look, that's an outside perspective that's not right. Like, here are some ways to just be cognizant of the things that you're doing so that you're not really projecting that stereotype.
I think that's always helpful because yeah, people can sometimes bring those biases in without realizing it, and especially for kind
Yeah.
of a region like a lot of people probably haven't been to, and the stereotypes are probably what, unfortunately, they've had the most exposure to. I think kind of having resources to kind of pull them away from that is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot, like you said, a lot of people don't realize, and it's not that they're doing something egregious in a way that's like they're not trying to be negative or stereotypical. We just carry that stuff, and until someone says, "Hey, right, this, can you rethink that?" Like we might not even know, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I think you guys put a lot of great tools in there. And one of the things I was surprised too, I think you're the first book I've seen that had two of them in there. You had two adventures baked into the book. I was like, that's a really good, because usually, like, sometimes you'll get one quick one, luckily, but there's two kind of freebies right in the book. So that's definitely kind of great for new GMs to the system. Uh,
Yeah, it seemed particularly important because the podcast tells stories, but they're a different form of storytelling than an adventure might be in this game. And it felt like asking like GMs and players to take the podcast and turn that into form that into a more adventure type story. Like I felt like we needed at least two examples to say, like, here are some ways that you can do this, because like we also did a fairy tale book a couple years ago, and like fairy tales are really fun and wonderful, but they're not adventures. And so we felt a really strong need to be like, here is how you take fairy tale concepts and turn them into an adventure, because fairy tales like have characters that don't have names or personalities and they all end the same way, and like how do you turn that into an adventure? And I felt like this was true too, because the storytelling style is so specific for Old Gods. It doesn't directly port into this idea of an adventure. And we were like, all right, well, we need to give people two completely different examples of how you could do that, and keeping this sort of sensibility of it's sort of based locally. So that's really important. You've got a community part. That's really important. There's something spooky and scary that people don't understand. That's really important. And then the sense of autonomy and helping your neighbor and helping each other kind of get through this hard thing. And so that was definitely our goal with having a couple adventures, was like, okay, here's how you do this. And then hopefully, GMs will be able to go and be like, oh, I see, and then make their own.
I think that's a great resource there, especially kind of given two distinct styles too to kind of bounce between, just to kind of really show off what the system can do. Uh, Pivoting away a little bit from old gods, especially with you being in the tabletop industry for so long, what was your first game that got you kind of just into tabletop RPGs as a whole? Doesn't have to be necessarily the first one you played, but kind of the first one that got that fire burning.
Well, the first I was about 7. My babysitter brought over Bunnies and Burrows.
Okay.
And I did not understand that it was a role playing game at all. I thought it was just another game. And mostly I just ran around and stomped my feet because that's what bunnies did. And it wasn't until years and years later when I was like, oh yeah, I played this game called Bunnies and Burrows. People were like, that's an RPG. I didn't know, right? Because it wasn't really a term that was tossed around because it was when I was 7, it was 1979. So it was really early. And then in high school, I played a lot of D&D. I played on the guys' soccer team because we didn't have a women's soccer team. All those guys played D&D. And so we would run around in the woods with sticks and play D&D. And I realized at that time, I didn't think I wanted to be a GM because the GM had to sit at the table while the rest of us were running around with sticks. And I thought GMing seemed really boring in that context. Those were my first kind of 2 introductions. And then, I left it for a while because I think I got really into computer games, and I just didn't have the community around me in the places that I was living. And so it took a while for me to kind of fall back into them. And I think when I fell back into them, it might have been like Call of Cthulhu. It might have been the first game I played again when I jumped back in at first. So
That's a fun one. I just got my first experience at Call of Cthulhu. Was it this year? Like a couple months earlier. That's a blast. I love kind of the Eldritch horror games, especially kind of with this one in Old Gods, where you kind of you're a small fish in a big pond. You have to kind of figure out what's going on. It's definitely kind of a
yeah,
fun
it's
little
very
game.
human.
Yeah, and I love kind of like the superheroic fantasy sometimes, but other times it's nice to kind of mix it up and just be like, you're small. We got to kind of still keep working to figure out whatever craziness is probably beyond your understanding that's going on.
Yes. Yeah, there's a parallel there in real life. I feel like where we're like, what is happening?
So with that, what are you kind of playing now? What's kind of the usual game in your rotation?
Well, right now I am playtesting a fairy tale game I'm working on an adventure for, and as well as a predation adventure, which is dinosaurs in space, dinosaurs in the future kind of thing. And then we play a every other week game that Monty is working on that is kind of it's almost like a mystery. I would say more, but I don't. We're so like we've been playing for quite a while, and I still don't know what's going on. And it's wonderful, and we're trying to solve this mystery and not die in the process. So that's been really fun. And we play a lot of games. Like I think we're just going to start another game that Bruce Cordell is going to run for us here pretty soon. That might be superheroes. And so we play a lot of play testing and a lot of one shot. And I sort of just love. I'm a huge fan of like one shot games because I like to try new things. I like to create new characters. I like to see what you can make happen in just a couple of hours. So it's one of my fun places. But like I said, we've also been doing long campaigns. Before this, we did a horror podcast game where we were podcasters for this horror podcast, and that was really lovely and fun. So I feel like we do a lot of different stuff.
It's always fun to kind of mix it up, and I'm right there with you on one shots. Creating characters is probably like my favorite piece of a tabletop RPG. It's always kind of fun to bounce between like genres and systems, so you can just kind of keep it fresh.
Yeah. Yep.
So, kind of speaking of that, what's been like your favorite character, whether from a one shot or a campaign that you've created recently, or even one of your books too?
Oh boy, that's a lot.
I'd say probably broad on the.
I always say that like my favorite character is my current character because I'm like really into them. But I would say also there was a character I created for an Invisible Sun game whose name was Incalia, who 8 books. That was really fun and a lot of fun to play. And she just sort of kind of didn't really care because once you read the books, the knowledge is gone, and she kind of didn't care that she was just sort of removing knowledge from the world, and it was very fun. Um, yeah, God, I love characters are one of my favorite parts. It's hard to pick a favorite character because I love them all. I will say, like from my fiction, I really love Talia, who is the character the main character in The Poison Eater, which is a Numera novel. And I feel like I put a lot of my heart into her, and so she's always been a favorite.
Kind of going along with that, especially kind of that's one of the things I see a lot of questions on just the tabletop space. What advice would you have for people kind of creating new characters, like just even outside of system stuff, just they kind of bring in just kind of some fun or some flavor into their characters?
I think it's so interesting because I think that people come from characters in so many different ways. And I think that there's a bunch of things to think about, like what characters inspire you and the things that you like watch and read. And if you don't want to take something like that whole cloth, then like imagine that character's kid or that character's sister. And so then like so that you can take a thing that exists in the world and then sort of step side it and make it your own. And also I think that how does like what is this character's way of interacting with other creatures, other characters, because of course role playing is such a group activity. And I do see like particularly new players often create a kind of standalone standoffish character, and I think it's because they're nervous about role playing, which makes a ton of sense. But it also makes it hard for other players to reach out and interact with them. And so I would say like find a character trait or something that connects you to other characters. Like I had another Invisible Sun character who had like this special thing of pockets, and so she was always pulling things out of her pockets to give to other characters. Like she's like, I have some candy, and like I have a lighter for that cigarette or whatever. And so it created this opportunity because I'm actually super shy and introverted, and so sometimes I have to give my characters objects in order to get them to interact with other players because they carry some of me with them. And so finding a way for your character to interact with other players, I think other characters can be so important because it opens the door for role play. It opens the door for interaction. It gives other characters a chance to sort of step in and do things. And also, like, I think play the thing that you find fun. Like I have never found like sort of run up and hit them with the sword characters terribly fun. They're not my thing. And so if I was going to play a character like that, I would also have to give them something else really cool that they did, a companion animal or some kind of magic ability or a sword that talked or something to give them a little extra oomph. And so some of it is figuring out what you love. Like, do you love to stand back and cast spells? Do you love to be all sneaky? And like, sure, try different things, but don't force yourself to play a character that doesn't get you excited and happy.
That's a really big point. One of my good friends actually who got one of my friends who got me into the hobby. Almost always plays like any system it is like usually somebody that has a connection to magic, D and
Mm.
D, probably like a wizard and other systems, just some connection to magic. But we were starting a new campaign and he wanted to mix it up, so he did like build like just kind of a typical tanky guy, a fighter, and he was like he was not miserable, I'll say, but he definitely he was playing against type, and you could kind of feel it a little bit for him. So I think that's great advice, and also too, I think it really big thing that new people to the RPGs, as well as even people that have been around for a while and maybe like trying to like build a character based off media. I think you
Mm.
kind of hit it on the nail with trying to build ways to, when you build your character, build ways to interact with the party, because a lot of times they can kind of forget that aspect and make a really cool character that just really doesn't have any the party can't really deal with.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think there's a lot of like, we bring a lot of our own personality to a character, right? And so, like I said, as someone who's kind of shy and introverted, it actually takes me a lot to play like an extroverted or a talky or whatever character. And so I feel like I find other ways around that, ways to interact, right? So sometimes it's kind of knowing yourself too, like knowing what your skills are. And like we have in our regular gaming group, we have someone who's very much a self-proclaimed extrovert, and every time he plays a character who's not very talky, like you can feel him holding himself in check all the time so that he doesn't just keep talking. And it's kind of like, I think he does it because it is different and it's this experiment, and his characters are always fun, but it's also like you could just tell he's like, somebody else talk.
You're just bursting to say something.
Yeah.
I think those are two big things. I know character creations, especially for new players, is always like the hardest piece. But I think those two will definitely just make it easier. Especially because I think, and you're completely right. Everybody brings a little piece to even like characters are completely different from yourself. There's
Mhm.
always kind of that little piece of you that's in there, some aspect of your personality that you want or don't or wish you had, kind of along with
Yep.
it.
Yeah, or wish you didn't have.
or wish you didn't have. Well, one of the cool aspects there. One of the big things we always ask too, and somebody who hadn't heard of Old Gods, the tabletop RPG, what would be kind of your big selling point for them? What would be the kind of the big draw to get them in to check out the game?
Oh, that's always so hard for me because I want to like go into all the little details of things I think are cool. I think that it's a game that has some really interesting pillars because it's heart and horror and hope. And I think those three things are a big part of what this game is about. And it's an interesting mix, right? It always creates cool things because you don't think of heart and horror or hope and horror together. And yet, I think that those are the sort of pillars of this game, and the way that they interact and mix as you're moving through the world and encountering people and entities and discovering magic, I think make this really, really interesting space and this opportunity to do some really cool things.
Definitely, I'd echo that, and if you haven't yet, viewers, go check out the actual play that we did. The crew had a blast with it, and one of the nice things with this too, it really kind of embodies, if you're fans of the podcast, like kind of the feel of the podcast, this folks in eldritch horror with kind of those ties to family in there as well. But the
Mm.
system is very intuitive and easy to pick up. I know one of my players hadn't really had a chance to dive into too much of the mechanics before we jumped on. And was a little worried, but as we went along,
Aw,
I got to see everything. Like it flowed well for me.
cool.
He was a little panicked at first because he hadn't had a chance to read, but it worked.
I feel that.
Perfect. Well, with that too, probably our last big question. With Old Gods, is there anything coming up with the table? Anything else you guys are doing with the Old Gods property for the system?
Well, we are still fulfilling the Kickstarter. So, for example, I've just seen that the plush version of Sam, the
Yep.
fearless and good dog, has arrived, as well as these really cool tins that we did for the Kickstarter. I have put the finishing touches on an adventure that was played at Gen Con, and then I'm going to run it at Gamehole Con, which is coming up. And that will be available probably either later this year or the beginning of next year. So far, the feedback has been it's made people cry, which is always my goal as a writer. So yes, it makes me very happy. And it's perfect for October because it has a rabbit in it. And that also includes some really cool audio that Cam and Steve recorded so that you can like play it as part of the game, as part of the adventure. And then we are just finishing up the railroad guide, which is this really cool at the table product where it like lists the how you can ride the railroad, but also has these really cool ads and like some other fun stuff in it. And so yeah, we're doing a lot of finishing up with the Kickstarter stuff. And our it's fun to see those pieces come in. Some of them are super cool.
I heard really good things about the Gen Con adventure. I was bummed.
Oh, good.
One of my buddies was able to play it, and it was a little too late to register. And you guys sold out very quickly, which is really good on that side too. But my buddy that played had a really good time with
Oh, I'm so glad. I love to hear that. It makes me so happy.
it. Well, definitely. Well, and also before we wrap, I want to give a major shout out to you. We always give away a free copy of the core rulebook for our actual plays. Usually, it's a PDF, but you were actually the first one that helped us be able to give
Oh,
away a free copy of the hardcover. And Steven got to win our giveaway on that side. So major shout out to you. Shout out for helping us do that in Monica Games on that side. We truly appreciate it.
I'm so glad we could do that. It's very cool.
And so, Steven, you'll be getting that pretty soon. So, this is probably, as I said, my favorite cover that I've gotten from any of my books. I really love just kind of it really evokes the feel of the system. So, definitely a major shout out there.
That's
Perfect. Well,
very
I
cool.
definitely
Thank you.
shout
I
out.
will pass
Oh,
that along to our graphic designer because I'm sure he will love to hear that.
is it the same guy that did? I know you mentioned one of your art team was the miner handing it out. Is he the
Oh no,
same
that was
person?
the other person on our
The
team.
other
We
person?
have this very small art team. It's two people, but actually, I think they work together on a lot of stuff. So yeah,
Okay. Definitely a great team on that side because yeah, the cover looked amazing. The miner guy looked amazing. I'm glad he didn't pass out with the
I
crowds in the heat there, but it was definitely a cool
know.
effect. Well, thank you, Shauna, for coming on. Before we go, is there anything, any other shout outs you want to give, or anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm so appreciative that we have such amazing Kickstarter backers, and we have teams like yours doing playing the game. It's just so wonderful to see people engaging in games in like community. And I don't know, I feel like as an adult, it's hard to find time and it's hard to find friends. And like I feel like games just do such a good job of bringing that together. So I love seeing that happen in the world. It's very cool. And thank you for having me. This was a great conversation and a nice way to spend a lovely fall afternoon.
And we were kind of getting that fall weather, but yeah, I completely agree with like kind of the tabletop is community, especially like it really hit for me during the first bit of COVID and quarantine, because that's was primarily what I got to do to hang out. It was like kind of a good way to meet new people while being stuck at home. So this is kind of a cool way to build community.
Yep. Yep, I agree. Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, definitely. Well, thank you again for coming on. For those who haven't checked it out yet, go check out the Old Gods of Appalachia at Monty Cook Games website. It's been a fun system, definitely one that we'll be running again. Definitely have to dive a little bit more into the Cipher system as well. But thanks everybody for hanging out, and until next time, everybody.